A man walked into one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, wearing a plain jacket, muddy shoes, and rain-soaked hair. Within seconds, the floor manager crossed the room and stopped directly in front of him. She didn't ask if he had a reservation. She didn't offer a greeting. In a voice loud enough for every table to hear, she pointed toward the door and told him he was homeless trash who had no business standing on that floor. No one intervened. No one said a word. What she didn't know was that he hadn't come to eat. He had come to decide her future. The rain had been falling since early evening, and by the time Adrian Cole stepped off the sidewalk and pushed through the front entrance of Harlow, the shoulders of his jacket were dark with it. He wasn't wearing anything that would draw attention under normal circumstances. Dark slacks, a plain button-down, a jacket that had seen better seasons. No watch visible, no briefcase. Just a man walking in out of the rain the way anyone might on a Thursday night in the middle of October. Harlow was the flagship location, the one that appeared in every press feature, the one that got referenced in reviews and industry events, the one with the longest wait list and the highest average check in the entire portfolio. Adrian had opened it 11 years ago under a holding company, kept his name off every public-facing document, and let the brand carry itself. Tonight, he was beginning to wonder if it was working at all. The complaints had started coming in 3 months prior, not about the food, never about the food. The kitchen team at Harlow was one of the strongest he had. The complaints were about something harder to fix and easier to hide, the way certain guests were greeted, the way certain tables were seated slower than others, the way some people left, feeling like they had been tolerated rather than welcomed. He had read every report twice. He needed to see it himself. He stood just inside the entrance and took in the room without moving toward the host stand. The dining floor was about 2/3 full. Candlelight white tablecloths, the low hum of conversation across a space that had been designed to feel both expensive and intimate. The staff moved through the floor with the kind of rehearsed ease that only came from years of training, and on the surface, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. Adrian had learned a long time ago that surfaces were the last place to find the truth about an operation. He noticed the woman behind the host stand before she noticed him. She was moving with the energy of someone who considered herself the center of the room, directing a server with a quick hand gesture, adjusting a reservation on the screen, scanning the floor with the practiced eye of someone who tracked everything and missed nothing. Her name tag read, Lindsay. She was sharp in the way that certain managers became sharp when they were given authority and very little accountability, quick to read, quick to decide, and almost never inclined to question her own first impression. She looked up. Her eyes moved across him the way a scanner moves across something it's already flagged before the data comes back. The jacket, the shoes still damp from the sidewalk, the absence of a reservation of a companion, of anything that matched the profile of a guest she wanted at one of her tables on a Thursday evening at Harlow. She crossed the floor toward him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir," the word carried no warmth. "Do you have a reservation?" Adrian told her. He didn't, that he was hoping to be seated at the bar or at a walk-in table if one was available. His voice was even. He wasn't performing anything. He spoke the way he always spoke, with a quietness that people sometimes mistook for uncertainty. Lindsay's expression didn't shift, but something behind it did. She glanced once at the reservation screen, then back at him. "We're fully committed tonight," she said. "Every table and every bar seat. I'm afraid we can't accommodate you." Adrian looked toward the bar. 3 stools were empty. A foretop near the window had a reserved sign on it that hadn't been touched since he'd walked in. He said nothing about either. "I understand," he said. "I can wait if something opens up." That was when the smile disappeared entirely. Lindsay drew herself up slightly, a small physical shift that communicated very clearly that the conversation had just changed in a direction she controlled. "I don't think you heard me," she said. "There's nothing available. There won't be anything available." Her voice had gone flat, and she'd stopped any effort to keep it low. 2 tables near the entrance had already gone quiet. "I'm going to need you to leave. We don't." And here, she made a brief, deliberate gesture toward him, as if presenting him to the room. "We don't seat everyone who walks in off the street." Adrian didn't move. That seemed to be the thing she hadn't anticipated. He didn't get angry, didn't argue, didn't make the kind of scene that would have given her a clean justification. He simply stood there, looking at her, with an expression that she couldn't categorize, and that inability appeared to unsettle her more than any argument would have. Her voice rose by half a register. "Sir, I will ask you one more time. This is a private establishment, and I have the authority to refuse service to anyone. You need to leave now." She turned briefly toward a server who had slowed to watch, and the server immediately found somewhere else to be. "We are not equipped to help someone in your situation." The phrase landed in the room, like something dropped from a height. Someone at a nearby table set down their fork. A couple near the window exchanged a glance but said nothing. The rest of the dining room continued its low murmur, and no one, not a single person, said anything at all. Homeless trash. She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. The dining room's acoustics were excellent, and she knew that as well as anyone. "That's what I see standing in front of me, and I will not have it in my restaurant." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. His expression hadn't changed. He said quietly, "I'd like to speak with the owner." Lindsay let out a short, precise sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "The owner isn't available to people like you. I suggest you find somewhere more appropriate for your situation." She stepped to the side and held out one hand toward the door with the studied composure of someone who had just won a confrontation they'd designed from the start. The room held its breath. Or it should have. Instead, the low dinner conversation began to resume in other corners, people returning to their meals, their wine, their own evenings. A few eyes remained on Adrian. No one spoke up. No one moved toward him. The silence of the room wasn't uncomfortable for them, it was convenient. Adrian did not walk toward the door. He moved instead toward the nearest empty seat at the bar and sat down. He placed both hands flat on the bar top and looked straight ahead at the shelves of bottles behind the counter. The bartender, a young man who had watched the entire exchange, met his eyes for a fraction of a second, and then turned away, finding something to polish that didn't require looking at either of them. Lindsay stood at the end of the bar and stared at him. When she spoke again, the composure was still in place, but it had gone tight around the edges, the way controlled things do when they're being tested. "You are making a very serious mistake," she said. "I will call security. I will call the police if I have to. And that will be considerably more unpleasant for you than simply leaving on your own." Adrian turned his head slightly and looked at her. "Then call them," he said. She did. She pulled out her phone and made both calls. Security first, police second, with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had rehearsed for exactly this situation. Then she straightened her jacket, smoothed the front of it with both hands, and returned to her post at the host stand, as though the problem had already been resolved, and she was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. The dining room watched and said nothing. A man at a table near the bar, mid-40s, dressed well, the kind of person who would have no difficulty speaking up, glanced at Adrian, then at Lindsay, then back at his dinner. He picked up his fork. 2 women at the foretop by the window whispered briefly to each other, and then stopped. A younger couple near the door looked at Adrian with something that might have been sympathy, but neither of them said a word loud enough to matter. Adrian sat with his hands on the bar and waited. He had been in enough rooms to know that silence was rarely passive. It made choices. It took sides. The silence of Harlow's dining room on that Thursday night was making a very clear choice, and he noted it the same way he noted everything else, without expression, without judgment on his face, and with complete attention. The security guard arrived first. He was large, professional, and visibly uncomfortable with what he'd walked into. He approached Adrian with his hands open, and his voice kept low. "Sir, I've been asked to escort you out. I'd appreciate it if we could do this without any trouble." Adrian looked at him. "I haven't caused any trouble," he said. I sat down. The guard had no clean answer for that. He glanced back toward Lindsay, who gave him a look that required no translation. He turned back to Adrian. "Sir." "I'll wait for the police," Adrian said. "I'd like this handled properly." The guard stayed where he was standing beside the bar, with the slightly lost expression of someone who had been given a job and discovered mid-task that the situation didn't follow the usual script. Lindsay watched from the host stand, with her arms crossed, and her jaw set the posture of someone counting down to the moment when the outcome she'd already decided on would finally arrive and confirm her. Adrian sat at the bar and did not move. He thought about the reports he'd read over the past 3 months, some of them just a few sentences, the kind of complaint people write when they're too tired or too discouraged to write more. He thought about how many people hadn't written in at all, had simply left and never come back, and never said why. He thought about the fact that every person in this room had watched a woman publicly humiliate a stranger and had chosen, one by one, to pick up their forks and look away. The front door opened. 2 police officers walked in, shaking rain off their jackets, scanning the room the way officers do building a picture, fast trying to establish which version of events they were walking into. Lindsay was already moving toward them, her expression shifting into something composed and cooperative, the face of a responsible manager handling a difficult situation on behalf of her establishment. She reached them before Adrian could say a word, and she began to speak. Her version of events was clean, confident, and built around the image of a man who had walked in off the street, refused to leave, and was now sitting at the bar without permission. She gestured toward him once, and the officers looked at Adrian, at his damp jacket, his plain clothes, the mud still faint on his shoes, and the picture Lindsay was painting found its frame very quickly. One of the officers started across the room toward the bar. His hand wasn't on anything, but his posture had made its assessment. Adrian watched him come and kept both hands visible on the bar top. The other officer stayed near the entrance, still listening to Lindsay, who had shifted into a lower, more confidential register, the tone of someone sharing important background information with someone in authority. She had been doing this, Adrian understood, for a long time. The officer who had crossed the room stopped a few feet from the bar and looked at Adrian, the way people look at a situation they've already filed under a familiar category. His name tag read Doyle. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, professionally neutral, in the way that experienced officers learned to be, but the neutrality had a direction to it, shaped without his knowing it, by the 2 minutes he'd already spent hearing Lindsay's version, before he'd gotten within speaking distance of the man she was describing. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside with me," Officer Doyle said. His voice wasn't hostile. It was the voice of someone who believed they were handling something straightforward. "There's been a complaint about your presence here, and the management is asking you to vacate the premises." Adrian turned on the bar stool to face him fully. "Has anyone asked me what happened?" he said. Doyle looked at him. "I'm asking you now. You can tell me outside." "I'd like to tell you here," Adrian said, in front of the same people who watched it happen. That was the first moment the room shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious on a recording, but in the specific way that attention sharpens when something unexpected is said calmly in a situation where everyone expected noise or compliance. A few more forks went still. The couple near the door turned fully in their seats. Even the bartender, who had been performing a very committed study of the glass in his hand, stopped moving. Doyle held his position. "Tell me what happened," he said. Adrian spoke without raising his voice. He described the sequence of events from the moment he walked through the door, the refusal at the host stand, the claim that the restaurant was fully committed, the empty bar stools he had seen with his own eyes, the reserved sign on a table that had remained untouched. He described Lindsay walking toward him, the escalation, the phrase she had used loudly enough for the entire dining room to hear. He was precise without being aggressive, detailed without being excessive, and he looked at Doyle the entire time without looking away. When he finished, Doyle said, "Ma'am," directing the question toward Lindsay, who had moved to stand a few feet behind the officer's shoulder. Lindsay's expression was composed. She had the practiced stillness of someone who had been in difficult conversations before, and had won most of them by controlling the emotional temperature of the room. "This gentleman arrived without a reservation," she said. "He became disruptive when I explained we couldn't accommodate him. I asked him repeatedly to leave. He refused. I called security and then your department because I was concerned for the safety and comfort of my guests." She gestured briefly toward the dining room behind her, a sweep of the hand that cast the room as evidence. "My responsibility is to the people already seated in this restaurant." "And the things you said to him?" Doyle asked. Lindsay's jaw tightened by a fraction. "I was firm," she said. "I may have been direct, but my priority is this establishment and the guests inside it." Doyle turned back to Adrian. His assessment was visible even if he didn't intend it to be the jacket, the shoes, the absence of anything that matched the visual profile of someone who belonged in a room like this at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening. The calculus was quiet and probably unconscious, but it was there, and it was working against Adrian in the same way it had worked against him since the moment he walked through the door. "Sir," Doyle said, and his tone had shifted slightly. Still professional, but the neutrality had resolved into something closer to resolution. "I understand you feel you were treated unfairly, but the management of a private establishment does have the right to refuse service. If you'd like to file a formal complaint about the manner in which you were spoken to, we can help you with that outside. But right now, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." The second officer had drifted closer to the entrance, positioning himself in that way that wasn't quite blocking, but wasn't quite open either. Lindsay stood where she was, her hands folded in front of her, her posture carrying the particular satisfaction of someone watching a sequence of events arrive at the conclusion they had arranged. Around the room, people were watching, most of them by now, not even pretending otherwise. But watching was all they were doing. Not one person spoke. Not one person stood up. The man near the bar who had looked at Adrian earlier was now focused intently on his wine glass, turning the stem between his fingers, as though the answer to something important might be written on it. Adrian looked at Officer Doyle. Then he turned and looked at the room. He didn't let the look become a performance, didn't spread his arms, or raise his voice, or make any gesture that could be read as theatrics. He simply looked at the people sitting at their tables, letting his eyes move from one face to the next, the way a person looks when they actually want to see what's there. A few people looked back. Most looked away. He turned back to Doyle and said, "Can I ask you one question before you escort me out?" Doyle didn't object. "Does a person have the right to walk into a restaurant and be treated like a human being regardless of what they're wearing?" Adrian's voice was level. He wasn't performing a speech, he was asking a question in the plain way that questions get asked when they're meant to be answered. Because what happened here tonight wasn't a refusal of service, it was a public decision made in front of everyone in this room that I was less than the other people standing on this floor, and every person sitting at these tables heard it and said nothing. He wasn't accusing them. The tone was too quiet for accusation. It was something closer to observation, which was harder to deflect. "I'm not asking anyone to fight for me. I'm asking whether anyone thinks that was acceptable." The room was fully quiet now, the kind of quiet that has weight. Someone's water glass caught the candlelight, and for a moment that was the only thing that moved. Lindsay's expression had not changed, but something behind her eyes had a slight hardening, the look of someone recalibrating in real time, trying to find the edge that would let her retake control of a moment that had briefly slipped sideways. Doyle didn't answer the question. He was a police officer, not a moderator, and he knew the difference. But he also didn't move immediately, and that small hesitation said something on its own. The man at the table near the bar set his wine glass down. He looked at Adrian. Then he looked at the tablecloth. He did not speak. Lindsay had run out of patience with the quiet. She stepped forward, and when she spoke again, the careful composure was still in place, but it had gone rigid underneath the way a structure feels when it's being held together by effort rather than confidence. "Officer," she said, addressing Doyle directly and pointedly excluding Adrian from the conversation. "I've asked this man to leave 3 separate times. I've called security and your department. I have guests who are paying for a certain kind of experience, and this situation is interfering with that. I need this handled." She turned then and looked at Adrian with a directness that was meant to close the conversation. "You don't have a reservation. You don't belong here. I have the authority to decide who gets served in this restaurant, and I'm telling you, you don't." Her voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never had that authority seriously questioned. That is not discrimination. That is management. Adrian looked at her. "You've said that several times now," he replied. "Who gave you that authority?" "The ownership group," she said immediately, cleanly, with the confidence of someone who had never had reason to think that answer could be turned around. Adrian nodded once. He said nothing else. Doyle looked between them and said, "Sir, I'm going to need a decision from you. Are you going to walk out with me voluntarily? Or, I'll stand," Adrian said. He got to his feet. He was taller than he'd appeared on the bar stool, and he straightened his jacket with both hands, in a motion so unhurried, it almost seemed like a statement. "I'll stand here in the middle of this room, and I'll wait, however long it takes." Lindsay looked at Doyle. The look said, "Do your job." Doyle moved to Adrian's left side, and the second officer came forward from the entrance, positioning himself on the right. The geometry of the moment was clear. Adrian standing between 2 officers in the center of the dining floor. Lindsay a few feet away, the entire restaurant watching from their tables, with the stillness of people who had all just realized, at the same moment, that they were about to witness something they would not easily explain to themselves later. The man near the bar had stopped turning his wine glass. The couple by the door had gone very still. Adrian stood and did not resist, and did not speak. His face was the same as it had been since he walked through the door, not angry, not frightened, not performing anything. Just present. Just watching. The attention of someone who was not surprised, who had known exactly what this room was capable of and had come here specifically to see it confirmed. Lindsay watched from her position near the host stand. Her arms were crossed. Her chin was slightly lifted. The expression she wore was the expression of someone who had just reached the final page of a story they wrote themselves, and the ending was exactly what they'd planned. She had called the police. She had given her statement. The man was about to be removed. Order would be restored. The dining room would settle, and tomorrow she would document the incident and file it as a resolved situation. She had, in her own assessment, handled it perfectly. The front door opened. Not the security door, the main entrance, the one that faced the street, the one with the brass handle and the Harlow name etched into the glass above it. Rain came in briefly with the draft, and then the door swung shut, and a man in a dark overcoat walked in from the wet street. He was somewhere in his 50s, unhurried, the kind of person whose clothing was expensive in the way that doesn't announce itself. He took in the room in approximately 2 seconds, the officers Adrian standing between them. Lindsay at the host, stand the full dining room watching, and his direction shifted immediately. He turned away from the host stand entirely and walked straight across the floor toward Adrian. Lindsay straightened. She didn't recognize the overcoat. She didn't recognize the face. But something about the way he moved without hesitation, without looking at anyone else, as though the geometry of the room had rearranged itself the moment he entered, and he already knew where the center of it was made. The certainty she had been holding began for the first time that evening to develop a small and unfamiliar crack. The man in the overcoat reached Adrian and stopped. He did not look at Lindsay. He did not look at the officers. He looked at Adrian and said quietly enough that only those nearest could hear, "I'm sorry. I got here as fast as I could." He turned toward Officer Doyle. His voice was still calm, still quiet, but it had the quality of a voice that was accustomed to being the final word in a room. "I'm Nathan Brooks," he said. "I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Cole Group. This man is Adrian Cole. He owns this restaurant. The silence that followed Nathan's words was different from the silences that had come before it. The earlier quiet had been the silence of a room choosing not to get involved. This one was the silence of a room that had just understood it had been involved all along and hadn't known it. Officer Doyle looked at Nathan Brooks. Then he looked at Adrian. Then he looked at the room the way a person looks when they're recalibrating a situation from the ground up. His partner had gone very still near the entrance. Lindsay had not moved from her position at the host stand, but something had changed in her body, a slight contraction, the posture of someone who has just felt the floor shift under their feet and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. Doyle turned to Nathan. "Do you have something that verifies that?" His voice was professional, measured, with no apology in it, yet just the careful neutrality of someone who needed another data point before they committed to a new direction. Nathan reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat and produced a card. He handed it to Doyle without making a production of it. Doyle looked at it, then looked at Adrian again. His expression was doing something complicated, the work of revising a story he'd walked into 30 minutes ago, believing he already understood. Adrian said nothing. He didn't help Nathan explain it, and didn't offer any additional confirmation. He stood with his jacket still slightly damp at the shoulders, and waited for the room to finish arriving at the place it was always going to end up. Doyle handed the card back to Nathan. He looked at Lindsay once, then returned his attention to Adrian. "Sir," he said, and the single word carried an entirely different weight than it had the last 4 times he'd used it. "I apologize for the circumstances." He stepped back, opening the space that had felt moments ago like a quiet kind of trap. Lindsay's arms had come uncrossed. She was standing at the host stand, with her hands at her sides, and her face doing something it probably hadn't done in a professional setting in a very long time, losing control of its own expression. The certainty she had worn all evening, that clean and practiced authority, that had moved through every part of the night like a current, was draining out of her in real time and in public, and there was nothing she could construct fast enough to replace it. Nathan turned to face the dining room. He didn't raise his voice, but the room had gone quiet enough that he didn't need to. "My name is Nathan Brooks," he said. "I'm the chief operating officer of the Cole Group, which owns and operates this restaurant. The man standing beside me is Adrian Cole, who founded this company, and who owns every location in this portfolio, including this one." He let that land for a moment before he continued. "What happened in this room tonight, what many of you witnessed, was not consistent with any standard this company holds, and I want to be direct about that while everyone is still here." He turned to Adrian. What he said next, he said without any performance, without the careful corporate distance that executives used when they were managing optics, rather than telling the truth. "I'm sorry," he said. "You came here to do your job, and this is what you found. I should have addressed the complaints faster. That's on me." Adrian looked at him. "It's not on you," he said. "You're here now." It was the first time Adrian had said anything that wasn't a direct response to a challenge, and the quietness of it, the absence of any satisfaction or vindication in his voice, seemed to land differently than anything else that had been said in the room all evening. Lindsay had not spoken. She was still standing at the host stand, and the composure she had worn since the moment Adrian walked through the door was gone in the most complete way. Not shattered, not dramatic, just gone, the way a performance ends when the audience has already left. She looked smaller somehow, though she hadn't moved. Her hands had found the edge of the host stand and were resting there, not quite gripping it, but close. Nathan turned toward her. When he spoke, his voice carried no heat, no visible anger. It was the voice of someone who had already made a decision and was now simply stating it. "Ms. Harper," he said, "your employment with the Cole Group is terminated effective tonight." He didn't elaborate. He didn't list the reasons they were standing in the room with everyone visible and already spoken. "Someone from HR will be in contact tomorrow morning regarding your final arrangements." Lindsay opened her mouth. Whatever she had been going to say, an explanation, a defense, the beginning of an argument she had already lost. She closed it again. She looked at Adrian once. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the floor in front of him, his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression unchanged from the one he'd worn since he sat down at that bar. She took her jacket from beneath the host stand, folded it over her arm, and walked toward the back of the restaurant. She did not make eye contact with any of the guests. She did not look back. The kitchen door swung shut behind her, and then the low sounds of the restaurant glasses movement, the distant sound of kitchen activity began to return, the way ordinary noise returns after something extraordinary has passed through a space and left it changed. Nathan spoke briefly with Officer Doyle, who resolved himself from the situation with the controlled efficiency of someone who preferred to let a misunderstanding close quietly rather than loudly. Within a few minutes, both officers were gone, and the dining room was left with the particular stillness of a space that had witnessed something it would be processing for some time. Nathan pulled Adrian to one side and spoke to him in a lower voice. Someone on the floor had recognized Adrian within the first 15 minutes and had quietly sent a message up the chain. By the time the police had been called, Nathan was already in a car. He had the names of every staff member who had been present, the evening's reservation logs, and the security footage going back to the moment Adrian walked through the door. Adrian listened and nodded. He asked Nathan to make sure the floor staff were spoken to individually, not as a group. He didn't want the reckoning to feel like a performance. He asked that the investigation into the broader complaint patterns be completed within 30 days, and that the results be shared internally without being softened before they reached the people who needed to act on them. The 3 months of complaints, Adrian said. How many of those guests have we followed up with? Nathan's expression gave him the answer before the words did. We're working on that, he said. Work faster, Adrian said, not harshly, just clearly. He looked across the room one more time. Most of the remaining guests had returned to their meals, but the texture of the evening had changed. Conversations were quieter, more careful, the kind of quiet that happens when people are still holding something in their minds that they haven't yet found words for. The man who had been sitting near the bar, the one who had watched and said nothing and turned his wine glass in his hands, was looking at Adrian now with an expression that was difficult to read from a distance. It wasn't guilt exactly, or it was guilt, but the kind that arrives too late to do what it was supposed to do and knows it. He held Adrian's gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. The couple near the door had already gone. They had left sometime between Nathan's arrival and Lindsay's dismissal quietly, without making a scene of their departure or of their earlier silence. They had simply ceased to be there. The bartender, the young man who had watched the whole evening from 2 feet away and had not said a word, was standing at the far end of the counter. He looked at Adrian with the expression of someone who had something to say and didn't know yet whether he had the right to say it. Adrian looked at him for a moment. You okay? He asked. The bartender blinked. It was clearly not the question he had been expecting. Yes, sir, he said. Then, I should have said something. Adrian considered that for a moment. Yeah, he said. But now you know what it feels like to be in that situation. That's worth something if you do something with it. He walked to the door. Nathan caught his eye from across the room and gave him a brief nod, the nod of someone who understood that the conversation was over for tonight and that the work started tomorrow. Adrian pushed through the front door and stepped back out into the rain. The street was quieter than it had been when he'd arrived. The rain had lightened to a mist that gathered in the halos of the streetlights and made the pavement reflect everything above it. He walked toward where he'd parked without hurrying, his hands in his pockets, the same jacket on his back, the same shoes on the wet sidewalk. Nothing about him had changed from the outside. He looked exactly like he had when he walked in, like a man who didn't belong in a place like that, which had always been the point. Behind him, through the glass of the entrance, the dining room of Harlow continued in the way that dining rooms do. But something in the room had changed and would not change back. A woman had been removed from it. A man had been seen in it. and every person who remained was carrying in their own private way the question Adrian had asked in a quiet voice and left behind without an answer. Not because there wasn't one, but because it was the kind of question that each person in that room was going to have to answer for themselves in whatever situation came next, when it was their turn to decide whether to pick up their fork or to say something. Adrian Cole turned the corner and disappeared into the mist. The street closed behind him, ordinary and wet, as if nothing had happened at all.